In the vast plains of Montana, where the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway cuts through endless grasslands like a steel serpent, a story unfolds that will challenge everything you believe about justice, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. This is the story of Maya Crowfeather, a brilliant young Native American woman whose desperate fight for her ancestral land leads to an unexpected alliance with the most unlikely person, a bitter, reclusive rancher who has spent 8 years avoiding human contact after losing everything he loved. What starts as a simple legal battle between a corporation and a family becomes something much more powerful, testament to the fact that sometimes the most important victories come from the most impossible circumstances. This is a story about two broken people who found strength in each other, about a community that refused to be silenced, and about the moment when ordinary citizens decided they'd had enough of being pushed around by corporate giants. You're about to witness one of the most remarkable acts of civil disobedience in modern American history, where a single broken-down truck became the symbol of resistance that inspired a movement across the entire country. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity. The taking the morning sun cast long shadows across the Crow Reservation in southeastern Montana as Maya Crowfeather stood on the porch of her grandmother's weathered house, watching the dust clouds rise from the approaching convoy of vehicles. The September air was crisp, carrying the scent of dried grass and the distant promise of winter. At 25, Maya had spent the last 3 years fighting the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad Company's expansion project through the courts. But today marked the end of all legal options. "They're coming, grandmother," Maya said softly in Crow, her voice carrying the weight of generations of struggle and resilience. Eleanor Crowfeather, 78 years old, with silver braids that reached her waist and eyes that held the wisdom of countless seasons, joined her granddaughter on the porch. The house had been in their family for over a century, built by Maya's great-great-grandfather, on land that held the bones of their ancestors and the memories of countless ceremonies. Every weathered board, every creaking step, every view from these windows told the story of her family's survival and connection to this sacred place. "The railroad wants this land bad," Eleanor said, her English accented with the rhythms of her native tongue. "They say their new freight line will bring jobs, prosperity, but they don't understand this land holds our spirits. Our ancestors walk here. The ceremonies that kept our people alive happened in that meadow." She pointed to a gentle slope, where wildflowers still bloomed despite the approaching autumn. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the house, followed by a county sheriff's vehicle and a large moving truck. The vehicles looked obscenely out of place against the backdrop of endless prairie and big sky. Men in expensive suits emerged, their polished shoes inappropriate for the dusty ground. Along with Sheriff Davies, a man Maya had known since childhood. His weathered face showed the strain of a duty he clearly didn't want to perform. Maya, Eleanor, Sheriff Davies, approached slowly, his hat in his hands, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry it's come to this. Lord knows, I've tried to find another way. The court order is final. You have until sundown to gather your belongings." James Morrison, the lead attorney for BNSF, stepped forward with a manila envelope, his movements crisp and businesslike. At 45, he was the kind of lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear for large corporations. "Ms. Crowfeather, the railroad has been more than generous with compensation. This property has been valued at twice the market rate. Most people would consider this a windfall." Maya's dark eyes flashed with anger that had been building for 3 years of legal battles, bureaucratic delays, and condescending meetings with corporate representatives. "You can't put a price on sacred ground, Mr. Morrison. This land has been in my family for generations. My great-great-grandfather is buried beneath that cottonwood tree. My grandmother was born in this house. For generations of my family have lived and died here. I understand your sentimental attachment," Morrison replied, his tone carrying the dismissive quality of someone who had never fought for anything that couldn't be bought or sold. "But progress requires sacrifice. The new freight line will create hundreds of jobs for the local community. It will bring economic development to an area that frankly needs it. Progress." Maya's voice rose, echoing across the prairie. "You're destroying native communities across 3 states for your profit margins. Don't dress it up as helping anyone. I've seen your company's quarterly reports, Mr. Morrison. This project will generate billions in revenue, while communities like ours get minimum wage jobs that disappear the moment it's convenient." The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass that surrounded the property and carrying the sound of Maya's words across the landscape. In the distance, she could see the existing railroad tracks, where massive freight trains thundered past daily, their horns echoing across the plains like the cries of metal beasts. Those trains carried coal, oil, and grain from across the northern plains, generating enormous profits for shareholders who would never see these sacred lands. Eleanor placed a weathered hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. Maya, fighting them here will only bring more pain. We pack what we can carry. The ancestors will understand. They survived worse than this, but Maya couldn't accept defeat. For 3 years, she had researched every legal avenue, worked with tribal lawyers, and even reached out to environmental groups. She had studied eminent domain law, federal regulations, and corporate tax structures. The railroad company had systematically acquired or forced out every property owner along their planned route. Using a combination of generous offers, legal pressure, and political connections, her grandmother's house was the final holdout, the last obstacle to a project that would generate billions in revenue. As the moving crew began carrying furniture from the house, Maya watched her entire heritage being loaded into a truck like common cargo. Her grandmother's hand-carved furniture, crafted by her great-grandfather during long winter evenings. The family photographs that chronicled over a century of birthdays, weddings, and graduations. The ceremonial items passed down through feathers, sage bundles, beadwork that told the story of her people's survival through conquest, forced relocation, and cultural suppression. All of it reduced to boxes and inventory labels. "Where will you go?" Sheriff Davies asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the moving crew. "My cousin has a place in Billings," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the pain Maya could see in her eyes. "It's not home, but it's shelter. We've survived worse relocations." Maya said nothing. She couldn't bear the thought of her grandmother, who had never lived anywhere but this land, spending her final years in a cramped city apartment, surrounded by the noise and pollution of urban life. The injustice burned in her chest like a fire that refused to be extinguished. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to stretch forever, Maya took one last walk around the property. She touched the bark of the ancient cottonwood tree, feeling the deep grooves and remembering the stories her grandmother had told about the spirits that lived within. She pressed her palm against the earth where her ancestors rested, and whispered a prayer in Crow, asking for guidance and strength. The railroad men had taken everything: the land, the house, the connection to generations of family history. But as Maya stood there in the gathering darkness, listening to the coyotes beginning their evening songs, she made a silent vow. This wasn't over. Somehow, some way, she would find a way to fight back. The spirits of her ancestors demanded it. The convoy departed, leaving nothing but empty land and tire tracks in the dust. Maya and Eleanor climbed into their old pickup, truck loaded with the few belongings they could carry. As they drove away, Maya looked back one last time at the place that had been her world, now reduced to empty prairie under a star-filled sky. She didn't know it yet, but her fight was just beginning, and in the most unexpected way. Help was coming from the most unlikely source: a broken man who had spent 8 years running from his own pain, but who was about to discover that sometimes the only way to heal is to fight for something bigger than yourself. The lonely ranch of 40 miles north of the Crow Reservation. Tom McKenzie stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the evening news on his phone. The October wind carried the scent of snow from the distant mountains, and the first frost had already killed the last of the summer flowers Sarah had planted years ago. The story about the railroad expansion had been following him for weeks, and tonight's report showed footage of the final eviction: a young native woman and her elderly grandmother being forced from their ancestral home. Tom was 52 years old, weathered by decades of Montana winters and summer heat that could crack the earth and a man's spirit alike. His ranch, inherited from his father, sprawled across 2,000 acres of some of the most beautiful grazing land in the state. Rolling hills covered in native grass, clear streams that never ran dry, and views that stretched to the horizon under endless sky. He ran cattle, mostly keeping to himself, rarely venturing into town except for supplies and the occasional visit to the bank. The loneliness hadn't always been his choice. 8 years ago, his wife Sarah had died in a car accident on a slick road during a March snowstorm. She'd been driving home from her job as a school teacher in Billings, eager to get back to the ranch and the life they'd built together. 2 years later, their only son, Michael, had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan during his second tour of duty. The double loss had broken something in Tom that never quite healed. leaving him with a ranch that felt too big and too quiet, surrounded by memories that both comforted and tortured him. He'd withdrawn from community life, stopped attending church services where people offered sympathies he didn't want to hear, and avoided social gatherings where couples reminded him of what he'd lost. The ranch became his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could work himself to exhaustion and fall asleep without dreaming. But watching the news, footage of Maya Crowfeather's eviction, stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. The image of the young woman standing defiantly in front of the moving trucks, her grandmother's dignity in the face of corporate bulldozing. The injustice of it all reminded him of why he'd once cared about more than just surviving each day. The railroad company's plans called for the new freight line to cut directly through his northern pasture, the section where he'd proposed to Sarah 30 years ago under a stand of cottonwoods. They'd been pressuring him to sell for months, sending lawyers and representatives with increasingly generous offers. Each visit followed the same pattern: polite conversation, discussion of the project's benefits, and then the presentation of a check that would set him up for life. Tom's phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Pete Sullivan. "You see the news? They got the Indian girl's place. Yours is next. Tom, maybe it's time to take their money and get out. Start fresh somewhere else." Tom didn't respond. He pocketed the phone and walked to his barn, where he kept his father's old Ford pick, one he'd been restoring for the past 3 years as a way to keep his hands busy and his mind off the emptiness. It was a 1967 F250, built like a tank, with a massive steel bumper and a bed that could haul anything. His father had driven it for 30 years, and Tom had learned to drive in that truck. Learned the value of hard work and keeping your word. As he worked on the engine, Tom thought about his father, who had built this ranch from nothing after returning from World War II. Old Jim McKenzie had been a man of few words but strong principles. He'd taught Tom that sometimes a man had to take a stand, even when it wasn't popular or profitable. "It's not about winning," he'd said. "It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror." The next morning, Tom drove into Billings to buy supplies, following the same route Sarah had taken that last night. As he loaded feed into his truck outside the coop, he overheard a conversation between two men he recognized from the Cattlemen's Association. "That railroad company's got everyone scared," one said. "They're using eminent domain to force people out. Courts are backing them up every time. Heard they're offering big money, though," the other replied. "McKenzie's place is worth a fortune. If he sells to them, that land's been in his family for generations. But after what happened to his wife and boy, maybe he's ready to move on." Tom pretended not to hear, but the words followed him home. That evening, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years: researching on the internet. The more he read about the railroad expansion, the angrier he became. BNSF was a massive corporation with billions in revenue, using legal loopholes and political connections to steamroll small communities and individual landowners. He found articles about Maya Crowfeather's legal battle, and was surprised to discover her credentials. She had a law degree from the University of Montana, had worked for a prestigious firm in Denver, but had chosen to return to the reservation to help her community. For 3 years, she'd fought the railroad with everything she had, working pro bono cases and organizing resistance efforts while living in a trailer behind her grandmother's house. Tom discovered that Maya and her grandmother were now living in a cramped apartment in Billings, nearly 30 miles from the reservation. According to a follow-up news story, Eleanor Crowfeather's health was reportedly declining. The stress of losing her home and being separated from her ancestral land had taken a severe toll. She'd been hospitalized twice since the eviction, once for chest pains, and once for what doctors called severe depression. Late that night, Tom sat in his kitchen, staring at the railroad company's latest offer letter. The money was tempting enough to buy a smaller ranch somewhere else and still have plenty left over for a comfortable retirement. But selling would mean abandoning everything his father had built, everything that connected him to his family's memory and the life he'd shared with Sarah and Michael. More importantly, it would mean letting the railroad company win. It would mean accepting that corporations could take whatever they wanted from people who couldn't fight back. Tom made his decision. He walked to his gun safe and pulled out a legal document he'd been avoiding: the railroad's formal notice of intent to use eminent domain. According to the timeline, they planned to begin construction on his land in 2 weeks. The document was filled with legal jargon and corporate doublespeak, but the message was clear: sell or be forced out. He wouldn't let that happen. Not to his land, and not without a fight. The next morning, Tom drove to the county courthouse and filed a formal objection to the eminent domain proceeding. It wouldn't stop the railroad permanently, but it would buy time and force them to justify their actions in court. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the tribal legal aid office on the Crow Reservation. "I'd like to speak with Maya Crowfeather," he told the receptionist, a middle-aged woman who looked at him with curiosity and suspicion. "She's not working here anymore," the woman replied. "She's been helping families with the relocations, but she's not taking new cases. To be honest, I think the fight took everything out of her." Tom left his name and number anyway, along with a brief message. "Tell her the railroad's next target wants to talk." That evening, his phone rang. "Mr. McKenzie, this is Maya Crowfeather. I heard you were looking for me. I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet," Tom said. "I think we have a common problem." There was a long pause. "You're the rancher there, trying to force out next." "That's right. And I'm not going quietly." Another pause. "Mr. McKenzie, I appreciate your solidarity, but I've exhausted every legal option. The courts won't help us. The politicians won't help us. The media covers the story for a day and then moves on. These corporations have unlimited resources and unlimited patience. Maybe it's time to try something that isn't legal," Tom said quietly. Maya's voice sharpened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's time to make it impossible for them to build their railroad. Maybe it's time to show them that some things can't be bought." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of what he was suggesting. Finally, Maya spoke. "Where do you want to meet?" "There's a diner outside Billings, Murphy's, tomorrow at sunrise." "I'll be there," Maya said. "But Mr. McKenzie, if you're thinking about doing something that could get people hurt." "I'm thinking about doing something that might actually work," Tom replied. "And call me Tom. We're going to be partners." The meeting took place at sunrise in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a 24-hour truck stop outside Billings, where the neon sign flickered against the pre-dawn darkness. Tom arrived first, sitting in his pickup with a thermos of coffee and a surveyor's map spread across his dashboard. The familiar weight of loneliness pressed against his chest. But for the first time in years, he felt something else: purpose. When Maya pulled up in her old Honda Civic, he could see the exhaustion in her face even through the windshield. The toll of fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds was written in the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of defeat. But there was something else there, too, a spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. "Mr. McKenzie," Maya said as she slid into the passenger seat of his truck, bringing with her the scent of sage and the crisp morning air. "I have to ask, why are you doing this? You could take their money and buy another ranch. Start over somewhere else." Tom studied her face in the dim light, the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, the determined set of her jaw, despite the fatigue that seemed to permeate her entire being. "Call me Tom. And I'm doing this because sometimes a man has to take a stand, even when it's not smart or profitable. That's not much of a reason to risk everything. You could lose your ranch, go to prison, lose everything you've worked for." "Maybe not. But I've been thinking about your grandmother. She's what, 78? And they forced her off land that's been in your family for over a century. How is she doing?" Maya's expression softened, and for a moment, Tom saw past the lawyer's professional mask to the granddaughter, who was watching her elder fade away. "She's not doing well. The apartment in Billings, ... it's killing her. She sits by the window all day, looking west toward the reservation. She barely speaks anymore, barely eats. The doctor says it's depression, but I know what it really is. She's dying of a broken heart." Tom nodded, understanding that particular kind of grief. "My father built this ranch from nothing. When he died, he made me promise to keep it in the family. I've been a coward for letting them get this far. You're not a coward. You're one person against a billion-dollar corporation with unlimited resources and political connections. So were you. But you fought them for 3 years. That takes courage." Maya looked out at the sunrise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the colors reflecting off the snow-capped mountains in the distance. "And I lost. They took everything anyway. All that fighting, all those legal briefs, all those sleepless nights, it was all for nothing. Maybe you lost the legal battle, but this isn't over. Sometimes the most important victories come from the battles that seem impossible." Tom spread the surveyor's map across the dashboard, pointing to detailed markings and elevation lines. "Look at this. The railroad's construction timeline shows they're planning to start grading the new line in 8 days. They'll begin at the northern edge of my property and work south toward where your grandmother's house used to be. And then the only way to access that section is through a narrow canyon about a mile from my house. It's the only route big enough for their construction equipment. Bulldozers, graders, cement trucks, everything has to go through this choke point. Maya studied the map, her legal mind immediately grasping the implications. You're talking about blocking access to a federal infrastructure project. That's not just illegal, it's federal obstruction. Charges you could go to prison for years. Maybe. But here's the thing. They can't start construction if they can't get their equipment to the site. And if they can't start construction, they'll miss their federal deadline. The project funding depends on staying on schedule. Every day of delay costs them millions. What exactly are you proposing? Tom pointed to a specific spot on the map, where the canyon narrowed to its smallest point. This canyon is barely wide enough for one large vehicle. The walls are solid, rock on both sides, no way around. If someone were to accidentally park a large truck right here, it would block the entire route completely. Accidentally, trucks break down all the time. Sometimes they need major repairs. Sometimes parts are hard to find, especially for older vehicles. Sometimes it takes weeks to get the right mechanic. Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. They'll get a court order within hours. The sheriff will remove whatever's blocking the road. Sheriff Davies is a good man, but he's got limited resources and competing priorities. And if the truck is broken down on private property, my property, it gets legally complicated. How complicated? Complicated enough to buy time. Maybe enough time to organize real resistance, get media attention, put pressure on the politicians who enabled this. Maya looked at him with new respect. You've thought this through. I've had a lot of time to think lately. Being alone gives you that, but I can't do this alone. I need someone who knows how to work with the media, someone who can turn this into a story that matters to people beyond Montana. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that anymore. I've been fighting this battle for 3 years, and I'm tired. The community trusted me to save their land, and I failed them. Tom met her eyes directly. Your grandmother didn't raise you to quit, and she didn't raise you to think that fighting for what's right is failure, even when you lose. Maya's jaw tightened. Don't presume to know my grandmother, or what she raised me to do. You're right. I'm sorry, but I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. The difference is, I lost mine to accident and war. You lost yours to corporate greed and legal manipulation. That's something worth fighting. Maya stared out at the sunrise, watching the colors deepen and spread across the Montana sky. Even if we block their access, they'll find another way. They always do. They'll bring in helicopters, smaller equipment, whatever it takes. Maybe, but sometimes the point isn't winning. Sometimes the point is making sure they know it's not easy, that there's a cost to steamrolling communities. Making sure other people see that it's possible to fight back. What kind of cost are you talking about? Tom folded the map carefully, his calloused hands gentle with the paper. The kind that makes other communities think twice before they give up. The kind that shows people they don't have to roll over for every corporation with enough money to buy politicians. The kind that honors the memory of people like your grandmother, who deserve better than this. Maya was quiet for several minutes, and Tom could almost see her mind working through the legal, practical, and moral implications. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. My grandmother always said that sometimes the spirits call you to do things that don't make sense. That sometimes you have to trust that the path will reveal itself as you walk it. She also said that our ancestors didn't survive by being reasonable. They survived by being stubborn. Is that a yes? That's a yes. But I have conditions. Name them first. This has to be completely non-violent. No weapons, no threats, no confrontation that could escalate to violence. The moment this becomes about anything other than peaceful resistance, I'm out. Agreed. Second, we do this together. If you're going to block that road, I'll be there with you. We face whatever consequences come together. Third, Maya continued, we bring my grandmother into this. She deserves to be part of the fight for her land, and our people need to see that their elders haven't given up. Tom extended his hand. Partners. Maya shook it, her grip firm and sure. Partners. As they sat there in the early morning light, both knew they were crossing a line they couldn't uncross. The railroad company had resources, lawyers, and political connections that dwarfed anything they could muster. But they had something the corporation didn't, the kind of desperation that comes from having nothing left to lose, and the kind of righteousness that comes from fighting for something sacred. The blockade would begin in 6 days. But first, they had work to do. Over the next week, Maya and Tom worked together with an intensity that surprised them both. Maya reached out to every contact she'd made during her legal battle: environmental groups, tribal rights organizations, journalists who had covered indigenous issues, and social media influencers who specialized in corporate accountability. She crafted a narrative that was both true and compelling. A native woman who'd lost her ancestral home, and a lonely rancher making a last stand against corporate greed. The story has to be bigger than us, Maya explained during one of their planning sessions at Tom's kitchen table. Maps and legal documents spread between coffee cups and the remains of Eleanor's homemade fry bread. It has to be about every small community that's been steamrolled by corporations. Every family that's been forced from their land for someone else's profit. Eleanor Crowfeather had insisted on moving to the ranch to help with the preparations. The elderly woman's health had improved dramatically just from being back on rural land, away from the noise and pollution of Billings. She sat on Tom's porch each evening, watching the sunset and speaking in Crow to the spirits she believed resided in the land. "Your grandmother's prayers are welcome here," Tom had told Maya. "This land could use some spiritual protection." Eleanor had taken to Tom immediately, recognizing in him a kindred spirit who understood loss and the connection between people and place. She spent hours teaching him basic phrases in Crow and sharing stories about her family's history on the land. In return, Tom showed her his father's tools and the places on his ranch where he felt closest to his own family's memory. "She says you have a good heart, but too much sadness," Maya translated after one of their conversations. "She wants to perform a cleansing ceremony for you before we begin." Tom, who hadn't attended any kind of religious service since Michael's funeral, found himself surprisingly moved by Eleanor's ritual. As she burned sage and spoke words he couldn't understand, but somehow felt he experienced something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging to something larger than his own grief. Meanwhile, Tom worked on the practical aspects of their plan. He studied the canyon access road, timing the movements of railroad survey crews, and noting the patterns of local law enforcement. He prepared the old F-250 for what they were calling the breakdown, carefully planning which components to disable and in what order. "The beauty of this," Tom explained as they worked together in his barn, "is that it really will be broken down. When the sheriff comes to investigate, he'll find a truck that genuinely won't start. No evidence of sabotage, no criminal intent, just an old truck that picked the worst possible place to die." Maya had spent those same days building their media strategy. She created social media accounts, established contacts with sympathetic journalists, and prepared a series of press releases that would frame their action in the context of broader struggles for environmental and indigenous rights. "We get one chance at this," she told Tom. "Once we move that truck, the story either catches fire or dies. We need to be ready to feed the narrative from the moment it begins." On the morning of the blockade, Maya woke before dawn to find Eleanor already up, preparing sage for a blessing ceremony. The elderly woman's hands were steady as she worked, her eyes clear and focused in a way Maya hadn't seen since before the eviction. "Today is a good day for standing up," Eleanor said in English, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "The spirits are with us. I can feel them in the wind." Tom arrived at the breakfast table dressed in his work clothes, jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He looked like any other rancher heading out to check his cattle, not a man about to commit federal obstruction. "You sure about this?" he asked Maya. "Once we move that truck, there's no going back. This could destroy both our lives. I've been sure since the day they forced us from our home," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "The only question is whether we can make it count." The stand at 7 a.m. on a crisp October morning, they drove the F-250 to the canyon access point. The narrow road was barely wide enough for one large vehicle, with steep canyon walls of red sandstone rising on both sides, like ancient sentinels. Tom positioned the truck at the narrowest point, where the canyon walls came within 15 feet of each other, then activated their carefully planned breakdown. He disconnected the alternator, removed a crucial fuel line connection, and loosened the battery terminals just enough to prevent the engine from starting. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died with a finality that sounded almost theatrical. Maya had live-streamed the entire process on social media, explaining their actions to a growing audience with the kind of calm, legal precision that made their civil disobedience sound both reasonable and inevitable. Within an hour, the video had been shared thousands of times. By noon, news vans from 3 states had begun arriving at the ranch, This is Maya Crowfeather reporting live from the Canyon Access Road, where the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad planned to begin construction of their new freight line. She said into her phone camera, the massive truck looming behind her. What you're seeing here is the result of corporate power run amok, of a system that values profit over people, and of the moment when ordinary citizens decided they'd had enough. Sheriff Davies was the first official to arrive, and he looked deeply uncomfortable as he approached the disabled truck. Tom was under the hood, ostensibly trying to diagnose the problem, while Maya documented everything for their growing online audience. Tom, Maya, I have to ask you to move this vehicle, Sheriff Davies said, his voice carrying the weight of duty he clearly didn't want to perform. You're blocking a federal right-of-way. Sheriff, I'd love to move it, Tom replied, turning the key with theatrical frustration. The engine made a pathetic grinding sound that echoed off the canyon walls. But she's not starting. Looks like I'm going to need a tow truck. This old girl's finally given up the ghost. The nearest heavy-duty tow capable of moving this truck is in Billings, Maya added helpfully, consulting her phone as if checking the information for the first time. And according to their website, they're booked solid for the next 3 days. Something about a multi-vehicle accident on I-90. Sheriff Davies sighed deeply, removing his hat and running his hand through his gray hair. You know, I can't let you block this road indefinitely. The railroad company has legal rights here. We're not blocking anything, Tom said, his voice carrying the innocent confusion of a man whose truck had simply broken down at the worst possible moment. We're experiencing mechanical difficulties on private property. If you look at the survey markers, the truck broke down about 6 inches inside my property line. By evening, the story had gone national. News crews from Denver, Salt Lake City, and even CNN had arrived, turning Tom's ranch into an impromptu media center. Maya had become the face of the resistance, giving interviews about indigenous rights and corporate power, while Tom continued his theatrical attempts to repair the truck, making sure it stayed broken while appearing to work desperately to fix it. The narrative Maya had crafted proved perfect for the media moment. Here was a young Native American lawyer who had fought the system through proper channels for 3 years, only to be steamrolled by corporate power. Here was a grieving rancher making a last stand for his family's legacy. Here was an elderly Native woman whose ancestral home had been stolen by legal manipulation. The story had heroes, villains, and stakes that ordinary people could understand. What we're seeing here, Maya told a CNN reporter as the sun set behind the canyon walls, is the logical result of a system that treats land as a commodity and people as obstacles to profit. My grandmother's family lived on that land for over a century. Mr. McKenzie's family built their ranch from nothing. But because we don't have billions of dollars and armies of lawyers, we're supposed to just step aside when a corporation wants what we have. James Morrison, the railroad attorney, arrived the next morning with a federal court order and a team of U.S. Marshals. His expensive suit looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of red rock and endless sky. Mr. McKenzie, Miss Crowfeather, you have 1 hour to remove this vehicle, or we'll remove it for you, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. I keep trying to tell everyone, Tom said, popping the hood and pretending to examine the engine with the desperate concentration of a man whose livelihood depended on getting his truck started. The truck is broken. You can't remove a vehicle that won't run. We can have it towed. Feel free to try. But I should warn you, this truck weighs about 8,000 pounds, and it's positioned at an angle that makes towing dangerous in this narrow canyon. Any tow truck driver worth his license will tell you that. You want to risk killing someone to move a broken-down truck. The marshals examined the situation and agreed with Tom's assessment. The truck couldn't be safely towed from its current position without significant risk to personnel and equipment. For 4 days, the standoff continued, growing more complex and politically charged with each passing hour. Maya coordinated with environmental lawyers who filed emergency injunctions and appeals. Tom kept the truck strategically broken while giving interviews about family ranches and corporate power. Eleanor Crowfeather conducted daily blessing ceremonies that drew hundreds of supporters from across the region. The railroad company's stock price began to drop as investors worried about construction delays and the public relations nightmare unfolding in Montana. Other communities facing similar situations began organizing their own resistance efforts. The story had become a symbol of something larger, ordinary people standing up to corporate power. On the 5th day, something unexpected happened. Tom was working under the hood when he heard the rumble of approaching vehicles. A convoy of pickup trucks was coming down the access road, filled with people he recognized from town, from the reservation. from ranchers across 3 counties. Ranchers, farmers, tribal members, environmental activists, and ordinary citizens, who had been following the story online, had come to support the blockade. They set up a camp around Tom's truck, creating a human barrier that would make any removal attempt a public relations nightmare and a potential tragedy. "Looks like you've got more friends than you thought," Maya said. Watching the crowd gather with amazement, Tom looked around at the faces people he'd been avoiding for years. People he'd isolated himself from after his losses. Pete Sullivan was there, along with families from the reservation Maya had helped with legal cases. There were environmental activists from Missoula, college students from Bozeman, and even some railroad workers who supported their cause. "I forgot what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. Sheriff Davies approached them that evening, looking simultaneously frustrated and impressed. "Tom, I've got to hand it to you. You've created one hell of a situation here. Just trying to fix my truck." "Sheriff. Right. Well, I've got news. The railroad company wants to negotiate. The media attention, the stock price drop, the political pressure, it's all adding up. They're willing to discuss rerouting the line around your property and providing a permanent memorial site for Maya's grandmother's land." Maya and Tom exchanged glances. It wasn't everything they'd wanted, but it was more than they'd dared to hope for when they'd started this impossible fight. "What's the catch?" Maya asked. "You have to end the blockade, move the truck and disperse the crowd. And you have to do it publicly, as part of a negotiated settlement." Tom looked at Maya, then at the crowd of supporters, then at Eleanor Crowfeather, who was sitting quietly in her lawn chair, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and red. "What do you think, partner?" he asked.